Hello and thank you for joining us on the Sport Chippers YouTube page. The second part of my conversation with Colin Fray is coming up. We'll talk about his favourite Forest player to watch and also the best ground that he's been to cover Nottingham Forest as well, so don't miss that. If you missed the first part or perhaps you missed the Q&A with myself, I'll link to both of those at the end of this video and hopefully you'll enjoy them. You can also subscribe, of course, to the page. We'll have plenty of friendly faces and Q&As coming up over the coming weeks, so do subscribe and you'll see those as well. But let's turn our attention to Colin Fray. The second part of my chat with him is next. You've been to a lot of grounds. We've been to a lot of grounds around the country together. Some of them at the time looked like they were falling down. Some have probably fallen down. Some of them were fantastic, great places to watch. You can't pick the City ground, but what would be your favourite ground and also least favourite ground that you've worked at?
Wow. I think the Emirates was pretty good. We had to wait a long time to get a tour at the Emirates, but to see the facility. I mean, we're only talking a couple of years before you left, maybe a year before you left, when Forest went down there in the League Cup.
It was Lamouchi's first season, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, wasn't it? Yeah, and they got hammered, but that was an eye opener because that night sort of made you realise how far away the City ground was from a new Premier League ground. And obviously there's lots to talk about building the new Peter Taylor stand at the City ground, which is going to have those kind of facilities in it to kind of get it up to top notch again. But you certainly realise that day how far off they were when you walk into the press room alone, never mind the banqueting facilities. The press room alone is bigger than the biggest room inside the whole of the City ground. And that sort of is a real eye opener. So the facilities, and then you've got a massive kind of lecture theatre, press conference area, and then you're led out into the seating area, and the seats are fantastic, and the press box is absolutely enormous compared to anything you've seen before. So I think probably you'd go for that kind of ground. Ironically, given some of the rather rustic grounds that we went to, particularly in the League One days or in various FA Cup ties. I mean, who can forget getting thumped 3-0 by Chester in the FA Cup under Gary Megson? But I think bizarrely, I would also choose some of the Premier League grounds as were in the very early stages, and I'm sure they're not like this now. I mean, I know that one of the grounds I'm going to talk about certainly isn't, but it's been a long time since we've been there. But the facilities at somewhere like Tottenham at White Hart Lane were dreadful, truly dreadful, cramped in, packed in like sardines, couldn't move, not enough room for your kit. Get your hand in your pocket, you're never going to get it out again for 90 minutes. Forget getting out and going to the loo, that you've got no chance. I mean, probably fire hazards, all sorts. I mean, they were dreadful. Manchester City at Main Road was awful. At Old Trafford, it wasn't great. It was kind of like in those days, the bigger the ground, the worse the press facilities. You were really tightly cramped in. Obviously, I'm sure. I mean, as I say, we haven't been to many big grounds like that these days for a long time. But I'm sure everything's changed now. Clearly, for reasons we talked about earlier about the influx of foreign media and the spotlight that the Premier League is under. But I did find it bizarre in those early days that Goodison Park at Everton was an awful press box with little wooden benches from what I remember. So some of those early, what you'd call sort of like top six clubs, they had a lot of work to do in terms of their press facilities. As I say, I'm sure they've done that work now. But I remember being taken very much by surprise at how poor some of the facilities were at those big grounds early on. But the Emirates these days is probably the best ground. And Wembley, of course, as well, where I did do boxing commentary once.
We should point out to the the YouTube viewer, there's a conversation I never thought we'd have. That you've never commentated on football at Wembley, and it's always been the ambition. Yet everybody else, I think, who's ever worked for Radio Nottingham, even if they've only worked half a shift, has been involved in a programme at Wembley. Yeah,
that's pretty much it. Yeah, so I managed to do Carl Froch in boxing at Wembley. I also did Mansfield in the playoff final when Wembley was shut, and that was the Millennium Stadium, which was great. It was a fantastic occasion, but it still meant I hadn't ever commentated at Wembley, and still haven't. And I don't exactly know what the stat is, but if you look at the stats now for which clubs have been the longest time since they played at Wembley, Forest are right up. If they're not actually at the very top of the club that's been longest since they appeared at Wembley, they're very, very close. They're in the top 2 or 3. I think probably they are at the very top now.
Which is extraordinary, given how many times they played there in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, just before I started. Yeah, second home. Everybody said Wembley's our second home. You'll be there twice a year. Yeah, it'll be fantastic. Oh, it's brilliant commentating at Wembley. Oh, the atmosphere is fantastic. Oh, there's nothing like it. All right. We'll see. One day I'll find out,
Colin,
maybe.
One day it'd be great, because honestly, I wouldn't want to miss that. It was absolutely sensational. Because I thought there was one ground, and I don't know if you remember the journey back from it. And I distinctly remember as we tucked into a packet of Bassett's licorice all sorts, which we got after particularly gloomy away journeys.
Yeah, well, you tucked into it.
I tucked in, yeah.
Nobody got a look in, did they?
Quite right too. I remember coming away thinking and saying to you, when Forest are back in the Champions League and we're at the Nou Camp one evening, we'll remember this and look back fondly on it. Do you remember where?
I can't remember. Where was it? Accrington? I don't know.
Cheltenham. Wadden Road, Cheltenham. I thought some of those League One grounds were going to be on your list of worst grounds. Colchester's Layer Road. Do you remember that one?
Layer Road, sitting on a balcony somewhere, from what I remember.
Yeah.
Again, they've moved now, haven't they? I mean, I remember doing it from a roof at Port Vale. That was the first game after they got relegated back into the Championship, back in 97, 98, I think. I did it from a rooftop there somewhere. I mean, there have been some dreadful facilities, some dreadful grounds. I thought Accrington was pretty poor. That was pretty ropey.
But I suppose some clubs give you, with respect to Accrington, Cheltenham and Colchester at the old ground, they give you what they have, and they don't have much, but they give you everything they have. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there are other clubs that have a lot more to give, but just don't. And that...
I can't think of any. You'll have to enlighten me.
Oh, I better not, because I might have to go back. But there are certain clubs who are in a position to offer you a great deal more than they actually do, and seem to go out of their way to make your life more difficult. And I don't know why that should be, but they're around. So when those games are coming up, you kind of think, oh no, not there again. And again, some of them are quite big grounds, and that's what I mean really. That they're quite big grounds with big facilities, and it should be a very straightforward media operation, but actually they've gone out their way to make it really difficult for radio broadcasters particularly. I think not so much if you're telly. You've got telly and the big money behind you, then the clubs sort of bend over backwards to do anything you want to do. But when you're in the radio broadcasting game, it's a little bit different in some places. And, you're shoved off into rooms and corners and cubby holes to do your interviews that are not very conducive to good sound on the radio. Let's put it that way. But yeah, there's been some places, and I mentioned Chester earlier. What a day that was in the FA Cup.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, there's some of those smaller grounds and the League One grounds where there aren't many facilities. They kind of go out of their way to welcome you and to give you everything you've got, and that's great. Notts County, as an example, it wasn't me featured directly, but last season Notts County got drawn against Morpeth in the FA Trophy, and Charlie, who covers Notts County for us on the radio, was effusive in his praise for everything that Morpeth did. They haven't got any facilities, and they're quite upfront about it. But whatever you need, we'll try and get you, and we'll look after you as best we can. And that really is kind of what you want from any club. As a member of the media, you're not asking for the world, you're asking for pretty basic stuff anyway. And if they're a club that has got the ability to do it but don't, then I kind of frown upon that quite a lot more than the clubs that don't have the ability to do it but try.
Yeah, absolutely. Sutton United I'd put in that basket. I remember one of my final games, certainly in the final season with Notts County at Sutton United, they could not have done more for you. Just absolutely extraordinary that you know what they tried to do. Players-wise, who have you watched? And we should say you were a fan before you were a commentator. Who have you watched in your 40 years watching and covering Forest? Yeah. Is that about right? Who's the best player you've seen? Actually, well, we might split it up in terms of modern era and previous era, if I can put you into two eras.
Well, I was a little bit too young. I mean, I watched, but I was too young to appreciate what they had in the late 70s, early 80s. So I was largely then a fan watching on TV or listening on the radio because I was living abroad to their exploits. My first game live, I think, was about 1981, and one or two of the European Cup winners. Obviously, that team disintegrated quite quickly, but a few of them were still there, and so I would say that I have seen some of the greats from those days, and so obviously, having seen him, you would have to say that John Robertson would be up there. But I was too young to appreciate him and appreciate the real talent that he'd got. And obviously, in those days, you kind of just expected that these players were going to come along and play for Forest, and that was how it was, because, you know, that's how it is. Things have certainly changed a little bit. But over my time as a broadcaster, the player who undoubtedly is the most exciting talent that I've ever seen pull on a red shirt, and by some distance actually, is Stan Collymore. His 2 years at Forest were something completely different, something they've not had before, something they've not had since. The pace, the power, the ability to just run past an entire defence and smash in a shot from 25 yards or wherever it was, is just something that you don't see anymore. And to see him do it through the Championship, as it was then, as it is now, and then get promoted and think, right, okay, well, can you do it in the Premier League then? Here's Manchester United at home, see what you can do, second game of the season. Bang, turn on the halfway line, run past the ball and smash it in. Okay, right, you can do it in the Premier League then as well.
Where did he sign from, just out of interest?
Can't remember. Was it Crystal Palace?
No, it wasn't. A snip at £2.5 million.
The former Shrimpers stalwart.
Absolutely. Of 33 games, I think.
You notice we're both wearing dark blue today. I mean, that's
absolutely. Quite right too.
He was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant. I remember watching him at a pre-season friendly. I don't go to many. I was still a fan then. I think I know his first season was a season where I was still freelance at the start of it, and then ended up being the full-time commentator halfway through it, sort of January of that year. So I saw most of his games that year, but the night in question, I went to Lincoln as a fan to watch him play in a pre-season, to watch Forest play in a pre-season friendly. He was playing. They won 5-1. He scored 2 or 3, can't remember exactly how many, but he was absolutely amazing. And I came away from that and remember saying, he's something different. We've never seen anything like him in a red shirt before. And I don't think we've seen anything like him since either. He was an absolute phenomenon for those 2 years. I wish he'd stayed a bit longer. Completely understand why he didn't. But Forest with him for another couple of years would probably have really established themselves at the top of that, at the top of the Premier League for a bit. Maybe not right at the top, but they finished third with him in the Premier League. And the idea of that these days is so far away that you can't even think it was real now. You can't even think it was the same club. But that's what a player like him could do. And my word, how they could do with somebody to stick the ball in the net like him now.
Yes. To kind of wrap up, I was going to ask how, here we are sitting on YouTube, so this might answer the question, but how the job has changed in Well, I look back to how the job has changed in the 25 years I've been doing it, and you're what, 30 years we've established. So how the job that you do now has changed in that time?
A lot. The 90 minutes of commentary hasn't really, I would say.
Apart from you're with Steve Hodge or Sutts or Lawsey.
The people you're with changes.
Yeah.
But in terms of that job for 90 minutes, there's not an awful lot that's different. Obviously, we're doing commentary every game now, and have done for goodness knows how many years. So I'm not sure there's a huge difference in that, but everything else that goes around it is hugely different. Social media has brought about a huge change in the way that sports journalism is done these days. I don't like it particularly. I don't really like any of it, but that's part of the job. If you want to be in the business, you've got to embrace social media, and so that's hugely different. There's a lot of things that are different now. My day now looks completely different to how it used to when I first started. Sports bulletins on the radio. The idea of a 5 or 8 minute sports bulletin on the radio that we used to do in the old days, forget that now. Nobody's going to listen to an 8 minute sports bulletin on the radio anymore. They're going to get bored and switch off.
You see, I would, but
yeah, but there's so many other options, isn't there, these days?
Yeah,
for people to kind of listen to or get their news from, and that's where social media comes in, and where the kind of electronic era comes in. Really, the digital era. There are so many places now to get your news from that kind of traditional news organisations have had to evolve a little bit. You were part of it. We changed completely the kind of way we work. So that side of thing is very much different. But in terms of covering the actual football match, yes, we can try new things, and we occasionally bring new ideas into the programmes on the radio and stuff like that. But actually, a lot of the ideas come full circle, and you just bring them back again.
Yeah. But if you've got something that's successful, and largely it was on a Saturday afternoon, radio-wise, it was successful in terms of ratings, and I think what we did on the radio sounded pretty good most of the time. There were occasions when things went wrong.
No, not very often.
There was one season. Do you remember one season where the line kept dropping like every 20 minutes? Which was, as Phil Neal said famously in that documentary, that was a test. But we got through it. But the fundamentals, the nuts and bolts, change not very dramatically from season to season. The fundamentals are still there.
Yeah, absolutely. There isn't a huge. That's what I say about in terms of actually covering the games. Yes, they've changed a bit since 30 years ago. Like I mentioned, when there was no expectation for interviews or anything like that. But within 5 years of that, there was an expectation of interviews, and that hasn't changed since. So it is very similar in terms of how you cover a match, and obviously you're restricted by resources. There's only so much that you can do. There's stuff you would like to do but just are unable to do. And I think generally in terms of how the radio station covers a football match, the fundamentals are there, and that's kind of what we do and always have done, and hopefully will continue to do for many more years to come. So it's the stuff around it. It's the day-to-day. I suppose it's the day-to-day. It's the Monday to Friday stuff that has changed almost beyond recognition from walking into a newsroom 28 years ago, whenever it was when I first started full-time, with the old-fashioned computer systems and the old edit reel-to-reel tapes in the corner that you used to jump on and get the old sticky tape out to stick two bits of tape together, and then take all those bits of tape down to the studios at the end of the day and produce your 5 or 8 minute sports bulletin or whatever it might be. That's entirely different now, with a much higher emphasis on the immediacy of social media, of breaking stuff on social media and getting stories out on social media. So that sort of stuff has changed pre-match interviews and post-match interviews and getting a programme ready, an hour's preview to the game, and then doing 2 hours of commentary, and then the hour after the game. That's very much as it has been. As you say, it's a hopefully successful formula that people like listening to, and that's why we continue to do it.
Long may it continue. We'll leave it there. Colin, thank you very much indeed. We worked together for 20 years, 20 21,
years,
99. Yeah. I don't think we ever had an argument, did we?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think we ever had an argument about anything.
We don't do arguments, no.
We don't do arguments, no. So it was a great pleasure, and I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
That's all right. No problem, Robin. Nice to speak.
Yes, my thanks to Colin Fray for joining us from home. I don't think Radio Nottingham will ever realise how fortunate it is to have Colin commentating on Nottingham Forest matches. Thanks for joining us. You can always watch the first part and my Q&A. I'll put the links on at the end of this video, and do subscribe as well. You'll see plenty coming up over coming weeks. But for the time being, from sunny Sydney, goodbye.